Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us at the next Care Connect session. I'm going to get things going. We're already past 1 minute past the hour, so I'm just going to get going. Let me just do a screen share. And once again, say welcome and thank you for joining us. Before we kick things off with our session, I just want to again let you know who we are, what it is that we do. So CARE, the Canadian Association of Agri-Retailers, our staff members, we do have a couple of them here on the call today. So our Executive Director, Myrna Gron, hopefully will be joining us shortly. She's just finishing up a meeting and will jump in as soon as time permits. But Jordan Sisawa is on our call today. He's our Marketing and Industry Relations Manager. Diana Svensson is also on the call here today, our Office Administrator Coordinator. I am Lisa Saragusa, and I take care of member relations as well as all the training needs. Tracy Shelton is assisting us with communications and our convention coming up November in Regina of this year. So please stay tuned for the information coming out regarding that. And Juliana Gran is part of our team too, and she takes care of all of our databases, our making sure that our CRM and all of information that we have about all of our members and everybody who's relevant in the ag industry is all up to date. We do have our CARE Board of Directors. I'm not sure if I see anybody. There may be some board members on this call today, so welcome to our board members if you are here. But there is a list of everybody who serves as a board member and here to help the ag industry as well. Next, this is how you can connect with us. So there's our address, our phone number, email address, and those are the social media channels that we are a part of. So make sure that you give us a follow, follow our posts, like our posts, share the post. The more that we can get information out about our industry and CARE as a whole, the better that we can be. And if you are on our call and you are not a member, we encourage you to become a member. So you can click on that QR code there. That will take you to our membership page where you'll find some information about the different categories and how to become a member. Do want to let you know that these Care Connect sessions, we started them last February and they've been a wonderful hit. Our reason for doing these sessions is to bring relevant information to our members specifically, but to the ag industry as a whole. So if you do want to see what Care Connect sessions that we have lined up, click on that QR code. It's going to take you to the list of our upcoming sessions, but it's also going to take you to where our recordings are. So if you do want to view some of our past Care Connect sessions, click on that link again or click on that QR code and it's going to take you to a listing again of what's coming up as well as the past recordings. Do want to let you know next week we have Victoria Schuler from CARC who's going to be talking to us about HR, human resources. So we know we have some small independent members or retailers out there, and anything that we can do to give you some tips and tricks and resourceful templates to help with all of your human resource needs. Victoria Schuler is going to help us with that. That being said, before I get to the next slide, I do want to let you know that this is going to be, or what we hope for this session is for it to be interactive, meaning we want your questions. We want to hear, based on what the presenter has to say today, we want to know what questions you have of him. So when we get to that portion of our presentation, we're going to encourage you to take your camera off. And in fact, if you want to take your camera off and we see your smiling face now, that would be wonderful, but we can appreciate that you may not want to do so. But when it comes to the Q&A questions, we just ask that your questions are respectful to what the presenter has presented. And if you do want to ask your questions, take your camera off. You can raise your hand so that we can call upon you. But again, if you're too shy, feel free to use the Q&A or the chat section. We will be monitoring that and we can ask the question when the time permits. That being said, let me tell you a little bit about our presenter today, Sean. So Sean is a research scientist and with the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the Saskatoon Research and Development Centre. Dr. Sharp works primarily on his high-priority herbicide-resistant weeds in annual agronomic systems such as kochia and wild oat. His research involves herbicide resistance prevention and mitigation, integrated pest management, and developing alternative control techniques. He received his BSc from Mount Allison University in Saskville, New Brunswick, from Dalhousie University in Truro, Nova Scotia, and his doctorate from the University of Florida in Gainesville. He joined Saskatoon Research and Development Center in Saskatoon in 2019 and has authored and co-authored over 60 peer-reviewed research and extensive articles, and currently serves as the governance director for the Canadian Weed Science Society. So I want to thank Sean for being here today, and I'm just going to allow him to take it over and go from here. So thank you. Welcome again, Sean.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Just to confirm, you can see my screen?
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're tuned in from. Again, I'm Sean Sharp. I am a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and today I'm going to be presenting an ecological framework for the prevention and mitigation of herbicide-resistant weeds. So to start off, I just want to start with a couple definitions so that we're all on the same page on what we mean when we say herbicide tolerance versus herbicide resistance. I'm going to be using the definitions from the WSSA, which is the Weed Science Society of America. But there are some other definitions out there, such as with HRAC, which is the Herbicide Resistant Action Committee. So according to the WSSA, they define herbicide tolerance as the inherited ability to survive and reproduce after a herbicide treatment that has never, and this is in the context is it's not historically damaged it. So an example of this would be the group 1 chemistry or the grassy herbicides in canola, which is a broadleaf that we grow here in Western Canada. And the picture on the screen is just from our plots to show an example of the canola. Now, with herbicide resistance, it is the inherited ability of a plant to survive and reproduce following exposure of a dose of herbicide that is normally lethal to the wild type, or that can also be interpreted as it has historically controlled the weed and now it's no longer controlling it. And some examples that I work on primarily here is wild oat to group 1, 2, and now group 15. It used to be formerly group 8, as well as kochia, which is group 2, 4, and 9 resistant, as well as group 14 resistant now, and that's an image of kochia on the screen there. It's actually an ornamental escape. You can see a little bit of the red forming there. It used to be called burning bush. This is very late in its life cycle, so the plants do produce a bit of that red from its origins, but the leaves no longer do. So today I want to introduce to you a series of best, or I actually prefer the term beneficial management practices now, where this is a framework that was introduced in the US by a lot of my colleagues in the southern US, largely with consideration to the corn, soy, and cotton systems. But they have tried to generalize, and I've taken that framework and I have applied it to the prairies in particular, but I've tried to generalize enough that hopefully if you are working in horticulture or forage, these tenets you will be able to apply as well. And I'm going to give examples from research from colleagues as well as myself on how you can use some of these concepts, but the examples are by no means exhaustive. So I'm going to try to, so this framework again was made a cross-cropping system, so I've tried to keep that in mind, and in designing it, I have attempted to incorporate practices that are going to help reduce the risk of herbicide resistance developing, as well as being applicable to use to manage it if you already have resistance in your fields in weed biotypes. So there's a lot of them on the screen right now, but I want to draw your attention just to the right side over here, as this is where I've categorized the different BMPs. So there is the premise BMP, which is to reduce the soil seed bank. So this is going to be the underlying premise for the entire system. So we want to prevent the weeds from going to seed, and we want to get the soil seed bank to be static or declining over time. Then there's the knowledge BMPs, which involve scouting and understanding weed biology so that we can understand what we're trying to manage and kill. We have the control BMPs, which are your typical IWM strategies to use a diverse approach. There's some in there for good herbicide stewardship, as well as using the other approaches such as cultural, biological, and physical or mechanical where possible. We do have some limitations here in the prairies for tillage and things like that due to other concerns such as erosion control. And then lastly, we have the space-time BMPs. This is kind of like a plus added to the IWM. So this takes the strategy and gives it a temporal and spatial element. So we want to manage weeds from January to December. We want to manage from margin to margin, border to border, and consider how weeds are moving in the environment to prevent them from coming in and invading that way. So again, the premise of the entire framework is to reduce the soil seed bank. So this equation was put forward by the group that developed this framework, Northworthy et al. And essentially we have two elements here. So every herbicide, when you're applying it, has a risk. If you consider the different types of herbicides, like the group 2s, which are the ALS herbicides, versus the group 9s, which is glyphosate, there is different. The weeds have shown to develop herbicide resistance to group 2 more than to group 9, so not all herbicides will have the same intensity level here. But the main thing that I want you to get out of this is it depends on the amount of weeds that we're killing. And essentially every weed that we have to kill has risk with it. And it becomes an additive effect, which is what the sum symbol means here. So to give you a very basic example of how this can accumulate, if we're doing canola snow rotations and we're spraying glyphosate pre-seed, in crop, and at desiccation, we are getting risk accumulation across all of those herbicide applications for every amount of weed that we have to kill. So if we're using kochia as an example, all the kochia we kill pre-seed plus in crop plus at desiccation, which is probably not very much. And then but when we use a rotation of herbicides, then we don't get the accumulation in the same way. So if we use a different mode of action as our in crop versus the pre-seed, then we don't get that same risk accumulation. I've also suggested this is like the genetic lottery that you don't want to win. So every weed would be like buying a ticket, and you don't want to win the lottery because then you get resistance. All right, so just to circle back, we want to reduce the soil seed bank. This is again the overarching goal, because that is where, at least in our annual cropping systems, that's where the weeds are going to be overwintering and emerging from. And we want that to be static or declining. So we want to prevent weed reproduction. We want this to be a perennial and encompassing strategy, again, from January to December, from field margin to field margin. And this is largely important because once the crop is up, once the crop has emerged, there's very few options that a grower can use to try to manage those weeds in an economic way. So it's good to have your plan put forward so that you know what you can do, so that you don't have to waste time trying to come up with options later, because that window is going to be very tight. All right, next I'm going to go through the knowledge BMPs, which includes scouting and understanding weed biology. So for scouting, this is very, very important, and we want to evaluate the weed populations across the entire field I will encourage extensive documentation, especially if you're dealing with herbicide resistance. What are the species you're dealing with? Where are they in the field? Weeds like kochia can be fairly patchy, whereas a weed like wild oat may be more spread across the entire field. You want to include what sort of management strategies have been used. This includes what type of pesticides are being applied. Are they using any pre-seed tillage? Are they using in-crop tillage if you're using organic systems, as an example? Have you used any competitive varieties? Those sorts of things. So that it's going to help you evaluate in the next year how well that strategy worked by how many weeds are now coming out of the soil seed bank. Specifically for herbicide resistance, there are two timings that I would recommend for detecting, and that's going to be after you have applied herbicides, which is the most critical time, as well as post-harvest to understand buildup. So after spraying, typically the herbicides, you should be seeing some efficacy at 7 to 14 days. But how quickly those symptoms develop will, of course, depend on the environment, the weeds, if you have resistance, and a number of other factors. For herbicides that you put on the soil with the intention for having a, a residual effect, typically those will wear off, and this depends on the herbicide and the soil, of course, and the available moisture, but it will usually start to wear off at about 3 to 4 weeks after emergence. And again, depending on when you apply them, if it's fall applied versus spring applied, there may be some additional considerations, but typically 3 to 4 weeks after emergence of your crop is when you're going to see that herbicide start to decline in its efficacy. Whereas with the herbicides that we're applying to the foliage or post-emergence herbicides, there's two types. There's the contact herbicides. This is groups 10, 14, 22. So that's like diquat on the 22. They're usually a little quicker because they're going to burn, if you will, where they're touching, so that typically you're going to see the symptoms develop quicker. With the translocating herbicides, these are herbicides that are going to move through the plant. So typically it's going to take about 3 weeks before you see death. If you're working with auxinic herbicides, the group 4s, that can be even longer, out to 4 weeks. And there's sometimes the plants will just stunt and just not die, but they just sit there. So just be aware of those sorts of things as well. But with resistance, the plants will definitely start to grow normally, so you will be able to tell. All right, next up is understanding weed biology. This is critically important because how do we manage things that we don't understand? I've included some points here as a quick summary of things to consider when you're looking at a weed. So what is its life cycle? Are you trying to manage something that's an overwintering perennial like Canada thistle, or is it going to be a spring annual like kochia or wild oat? The emergence patterns, when is it coming out of the soil and for how long? With the flowering timing, this is important because typically, I think across most herbicides, once the weed starts to flower, it's going to be harder to kill with the herbicide in general, and typically that is outside of the spray window. So that would represent kind of a transitionary period in management. The flowering timing is also important to know for her to manage things like kochia, because the pollen, and I'll talk about this in a sec, but the pollen can move the traits around as well. Then the seed production timing is very important because, again, we want to prevent weed reproduction. So we don't want them to go to seed. So we need to definitely get in there. That is the latest timing, and then understand its dispersal. So is it a grain mimic like wild oat and it's going to move in the grain, or is it a tumbleweed like kochia and it's going to move in the wind? So I did develop an ecological profile for kochia which I'll present here. This is an image from my greenhouse. So the plant's a little more stretched than normally because the light was a little bit limiting in there at that time, but you can see it does have a number of trichomes on the leaves, which are hairs on the leaves. So when it's really, really small. So it is an early emerging annual. It's typically one of the first weeds that I see up in the spring into April. But with that said, it does have a very long growing season, so it doesn't start to produce seed typically until the fall. We will go out on the kosher survey in October, but my colleague, Dr. Geddes, has been noting that he is getting more viable seed for the pre-harvest testing of kochia, which would indicate that it's starting to fall in line with our spring annual crops for crop mimicry. Essentially, it is patch forming. So what this means is it moves around as a tumbleweed in the environment. It'll break off at the soil, and so you get typically a pretty large dump of seed where the tumbleweed comes to rest. And then there's a lot of competition between the plants, and then it kind of forms a patch that way because the plants can't grow to full size. Compared to if they were just one plant by itself. And again, in the pollen, it has been noted that those traits for resistance, the group 2, the group 9 at least, can move that way. So if you do have plants that are not managed on the borders, the traits can move there and then be a refuge and then move back into the crop where the kochia is later on. So not good. Kochia is a prolific seed producer, and quite a few of our problematic weeds are. This is probably a bit of a low estimate per plant. And again, this is a tumbleweed. It breaks off at the soil surface naturally and will tumble in the wind, which I'm sure a lot of people, if you're in the prairies, have seen. The one chink in the armor for kochia, if you will, is that it has a very short soil persistence. So if we can extensively manage it for 2 to 3 years, it should help with that seed bank, with the caveat that kochia does have a lot of immigration with the tumbleweeds, so you can still have it coming back in. All right, next we're going to move into the control BMPs, and this includes diversification as well as some good BMPs for chemical stewardship and using cultural, biological, and mechanical practices where feasible. Diversification really is the name of the game here. I feel like previously we have been very narrow with our approach. We're all using the same type of herbicides. We're all using the same type of cultivars. We want to try to switch things up as much as possible so that when the weed is emerging year to year, it's having to grow in different environments, etc. The main approach is to prevent weed reproduction once more, and we want to target the weeds that are going to be the most problematic to you in your field, as well as ones that may develop resistance. So, for example, if you're farming to the north here in the province, you may have a lot of wild buckwheat, so that may be one of them. And then if you're in an area where you do have kochia starting to tumble in, that may be the second one you add to your list. So this is one that should be well toted through the industry at this point. We want to use multiple modes of action of herbicides for a given species. If I'm dealing with kochia, group 2 herbicides are not effective. It's been quite well documented now that that trait has spread through the populations in the prairies. So I would pull that out of your chemical rotation and just pick ones that are effective. When in doubt, please get an HR test. There's lots of labs now that are able to do, well, not lots, but there are labs that are able to do that testing for you. Typically, you would have to collect seeds at the end of season and then send them in for testing, and then they'll grow them out and spray them. So there's lots of ways that we can introduce multiple modes of action into a crop rotation. We can do tank mixes, and a lot of the chemical companies are selling tank mixes now to help promote that, which is great. You can also do layering. This is most commonly seen as doing pre-emerge residual herbicides to the soil so that when the weeds germinate, that chemistry is already there, and then later on they'll use a in-crop herbicide of a different mode of action to manage any weeds that emerge later once that pre starts to wear off. And then, of course, you can do it year to year as well by picking the crops. And we'll talk about that a bit. So if you have resistance, quite likely you may have to switch modes of action. You might be switching what you're doing as in-crop herbicides. So one thing I want to flag is it's really important to read the labels, because when you switch modes of action, the staging that the weed, which I have kochia on here as an example, is going to change. And I haven't put any specific products on here because I didn't want to call anybody out, but we do switch from sizing to leaf number. So just be very cognizant of that. And typically when you're using these type of herbicides down here, the plants are bigger, 10 to 15 centimeters tall with the glyphosate, whereas if you switch to glufosinate, which our growers might be doing in canola, for example, the kochia can't be as big. So again, spray the full rate, and please make sure that you're spraying it on the proper staging, because kochia is unforgiving for that. Next, BMP is going to be using cultural practices, and this is kind of where we can really open up a lot of strategies. So with crop rotations, typically it's touted that introducing a new crop can bring in brand new chemistry to the rotation. At least in the prairies, I find this is not quite relevant and quite true. A lot of the crops already have, for example, group 2 tolerance from breeding, and the options coming in are not really great. So just kind of keep that in mind. The main thing with the crop rotation, though, is you do get a change in life form. So I will continue to use kochia as an example, or wild oat, where you have them competing against a grass one year and then a broadleaf the next year, so that canopy can change. And then the ultimate change here would be if you change from a spring annual system to an overwintering annual, like winter wheat, fall rye, or switching to a perennial forage if your weeds are really bad, such as alfalfa, although that's just one option there. And then if we're sticking into the cropping systems, canopy closure is really the big tenet that I want to promote, especially if you're using any pre-emerge herbicides. You want to make sure your canopy is closed before that herbicide starts to wane, so that if you do get any wild oats coming up later, if you get a flush of rain, for example, that crop is going to be competitive, and it's going to compete for the space, the light, the water, so that weed's going to have to struggle for its life just to get through that canopy. And there's lots of ways to do this. And I don't want to give you a prescription, because I think that's kind of how we get into trouble. But there's lots of options for competitive crops and varieties, row spacing, seeding rates, and I'm going to talk about a few examples of that. And then planting date as well. For something like kochia, that can be helpful, where you may want to allow the weeds to flush first, spray them with the broad spectrum herbicides, or do some pre-seed tillage depending on where you're at, and then go ahead and plant afterwards. So this is a paper, it's a bit of an older one from 2000. But these authors had to look at wheat and barley in competition with varying levels of kochia. So it gives a very interesting visual for how they compete against kochia when they're grown at the same time. So we have wheat over here, barley over here, and the relative yield on the x-axis. The circles are the crop, and the triangles are the kochia, and then these top ones are the overall relative yield for both of them. And this kind of just shows you that amount of land will produce a given amount of biomass, and that it's kind of changed and traded off between the crop and the weed. Where the two lines intersect gives you an idea of its relative competition and how much kochia it's able to tolerate relative or before the kochia overtakes it. So in the wheat here, we do see it's over around 25 to 30% kochia before we get that crossing, whereas in the barley, we're well over close to 70%, I would say, just to show that barley is typically more competitive to wheat against kochia, and this is also true against wild oat. There have been studies to show this. So crop selection is very important, and it's one that's going to impact you all growing seasons. So the next cultural practice that I wanted to highlight is to use higher rates of seeding. This is some research that was conducted in Saskatchewan by Steve Shirtliff's lab in 2009. We have biomass on the y-axis and seeding rate on the x-axis. The industry standard is about 80 seeds per square meter here for peas. And sorry, this is in-field pea. The weeds are just what was coming out of the seed bank, so it wasn't any particular species. And what they found is that when you increase the biomass present through when you increase the seeding rate, you get a higher biomass in the crop and then a lower biomass for the weeds. And when you have less weed biomass, you typically get less weed seed. So then you have less weed seed going back into the seed bank. And they had also found that this did also promote a bump in yield as well. Our eighth BMP is to use mechanical or biological practices where feasible. On the biological side, there's not a really good options for wild oat and kochia. They don't really have much to report there. Although for kochia in particular, since it is patchy, there may be options for targeted grazing. I've been talking to some growers who have been using it as a feed, and there's some research about using kochia as a feed for cattle. Please do some research if you're looking into that, since it depends on the staging. But our best options right now are either spot or selective tillage, so kind of tilling the patches under. And I would recommend this about once every 3 years. You don't want to have that soil or those seeds working their way through the entire soil spectrum. You want to just put them down below and just have them die for a couple of years. We've done some research on mowing. It is effective, but kochia, although it is an early emerging annual, it does flush in the patches just because there's a lot of seed there. And again, we want to mow before flowering typically. This is some research out of Lacombe, Alberta by my colleague, Dr. Brianne Tideman, that she did in 2020, or this was published in 2020. This is on wild oat. I wanted to change it up a little bit for you. So there's 3 bars here. This is in a wheat crop on the A panel, and then the B panel is in lentil, which is a shorter crop legume that we grow in the prairies. And this is on wild oat, and what she's measuring is the size or the top of the crop canopy, which is your red bar right here in the lentil, right here in the wheat. And then what is the lowest panicle or the spike on the wild oat panicle? Just kind of right here and right here. And then where is the average, which is typically higher? So what she's evaluating here is the feasibility of using a clipping approach to prevent weed reproduction on the wild oat that's growing either in the wheat or the lentils. So you can see on this side, there is a good amount of distance in lentils, so that may be a good option, whereas in the wheat, might be hard to get some of these because they're going to be in the crop canopy, although it looks like a number of the wild oat panicles do go above, so it will be very effective over here in the lentil and maybe not so much in the wheat. You could use a dwarf variety to try to create that distance, but please be aware that typically in crops, it's plant height where that's going to make them competitive, so you may lose some competitiveness to try to get that distance. All right, our last chunk of BMPs are the space-time BMPs, where we're going to talk about spatial and temporal considerations for controlling weeds. So the first one is to manage weeds at pre-seeding. This is one I think a lot of growers are doing already. So again, we can use a stale seed bed approach, and this is going to depend on the type of weeds that you're targeting. Something like kochia, it can be helpful. Whereas others like wild oat, which is not on here, I realized, would be more later emerging. This research is out of Iowa, and they were evaluating the emergence of all of the different weeds coming out of the soil seed bank at the same site, and then categorizing them based on their emergence profile over the growing season. And then this line is I've placed on here just to give you an idea of where you might try to do a foliar application of a herbicide. So if I'm trying to kill the kochia and I'm applying the herbicide here, what I want you to see is if I'm also battling invasive pigweeds like water hemp, or if I got red root pigweed, I will be missing them entirely. So that spray to manage the kochia, not going to help with the pigweeds. And it's going to be the same thing with wild oat. You may have a little bit of wild oat up, but there'll be lots more to come later. So anything you're trying to do pre-seed on kochia is not going to help with that wild oat. So just have a good idea of the spectra of weeds that are emerging from the soil, and keep an eye on weeds that might be building up based off of your current control strategies to try to manage the ones up here. So the 10th BMP is to manage weeds at or after harvest. Now, this is not really a good time for herbicides. Most of the weeds have been growing all season, kochia in particular. Even at the desiccation timing, not great. There's already going to be seeds on there, so you're basically exposing them at when they're too big, which is going to lead to HR problems in the future as well, is my concern. So not a great timing to try to manage annual weeds. There is an approach with glyphosate for perennials, but not really a good time for annuals. So the type of research I wanted to show is for harvest weed seed control. And this can be done a number of ways, but I wanted to show you some work, again, by Dr. Tideman out of Lacombe on the seed terminators. Or sorry, this is the heritage seed destructor. And here, both of these axes start at 95 to 97%. So she's seeing very high control here. And we have, so it's control in the y-axis. And then in this left panel, we see different weed species. And these were selected based off the seed size, which is the number in brackets here. So we have kochia, which is very, very small. And then we have wild oat, which is quite big in comparison. It's more the size of our grains. And then we have, on this side, we have 3 different chaff types that are common in the prairie. So we have barley as a cereal, we have the canola, and then we have peas here for a pulse. And overall, these seed mills were very effective at managing lots of different weeds. So it's a broad spectrum option, and it does work on a broad number of our chaff types. So this actually fits in very well to our production systems, and we have been seeing uptake, which is good. Now, there are other ways to do this. You can collect the chaff in a chaff cart, for example, if you have a bad kochia infestation, and then move that material out. You can bale it. You can do chaff lining. There's lots of other options as well. So the 11th BMP is to prevent the movement of weeds between and within fields. So again, kochia is a tumbleweed. It's going to be moving around. You can use fences. This is just a picture of our pollinator strip from last year using hairy vetch and sunflowers. And then we have a tree line in the background. These are going to help stop tumbleweeds, of course, and you're going to get tumbleweeds catching up on pollinator strips or tree lines or fences, or whatever you use. Any quick drive through the prairie, you will see this. What I'm going to suggest, though, is that you need to still have some sort of broad spectrum herbicide or physical management program, because you're going to catch the weeds there, but it's only going to take a year or two for them to move on if you don't manage them. So if you have a fence and you have a a tumbleweed moving at a pretty good click and it hits the fence, it's going to move the seed onto the other side of that fence, unless it's solid, and it's not very feasible to use that kind of fencing here. So it's still advisable to try to have some sort of option to manage those weeds if it's mowing or a broad spectrum herbicide. Now, if you have a really bad field for weeds, the order that you harvest your fields can also help. So you can try to harvest your clean fields first and then move to your dirty fields. And this way, if you are moving weeds around, you are moving them to the dirtier fields so that infestation is being maintained there instead of moving to your cleaner fields. And then for something like wild oat, use certified seed, which is because that is how wild oat is going to move around. It is a grain mimic. It's a different creature than the kochia. So with the wild oat, it's going to emerge when the cereals are emerging. It's going to shatter when the cereals are shattering. So it's going to become a grain contaminant. So we want to prevent introducing more of those seeds into the landscape. And the way we do that is through the certified seed programming. All right, the last BMP I have for you today is to manage field borders. This can include sloughs and windbreaks, which I covered a little bit in the last one. But so this is a field that we were on for the kochia survey in 2019. And this middle area here is actually where kochia managed to infest. They did have a perennial margin here, but there was a bit of disturbance and that kochia tumbled in. And so now it's all in here. That's that purplish, bluish color. So this is more for weeds like kochia, since they are tumbleweeds. And the main ideas here is we want to have either a perennial grass on the margin because that's going to be quite competitive against the spring annuals that are being introduced. You can also keep it clean with herbicides, although that's not quite as great of an option since you may have to reapply multiple times. And the main idea here is we want to prevent influx into that field. We don't want to spend a whole bunch of money over here and then just have the kochia come back in. So I call this closing the back door. All right, so that is all of the BMPs I have for you today. So again, the premise BMP is to prevent or to reduce the soil seed bank. We want to use our knowledge BMPs of scouting and understanding weed biology. We want to use a diversified program for weed management and apply as many tools as we can. And we want to take in spatial and temporal options to prevent the weeds from going to seed and spreading through our fields. So, you know, I want you to know your enemy in this. I want you to know the weed, know its ecology, know where it has advantages and know where it has weaknesses, know the tool that you're using, and it's not just about herbicides, and please be mindful of field edges and movement of weeds through the landscape. There's my email if you do have any questions, and I will pause there for the Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sean, for sharing that with us. I'm Myrna. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here right at the beginning. We do have a question that has come in. And of course, this session now is to engage in a discussion. It could be questions for Sean. You could have questions for the entire group to sort of talk about how you're handling this within your different parts of Canada that you're coming from. But Mark's asking, I've heard that kochia is resistant to group 4 in agronomy sessions. This is something I have not seen yet in my area. I think it's a hammer for kochia. Seymour. Okay, what's the rest of this one say here? How long does it take kochia to build resistance to group 4?
Good question. So group 4 is oxenic herbicides, and there's a bunch of different classes in that. And so that's a very hard question. So if we look at the group 2 chemistry, we first found that resistance in 1988, and then around the mid-2000s, most of the populations had it. We're seeing the same trend with glyphosate, and it is accelerating. In 2019, we didn't really see a high expression of herbicide resistance, but we were detecting it, meaning we were seeing it pop up across the prairies. It's going to be slower because we are dosing the plants with a plant signal that they need, which is a little different mode of action than the group 2s, for example. So if there is a mutation to the group 4 chemistry, it may have consequences to the fitness of the plant, which means that should slow down the development. But with that said, kochia is a very resilient beast and already has a lot of adaptations to stress. So I don't have a good solution for that, unfortunately. We are seeing it. I have a biotype here that definitely expresses it. So it can happen. It's kind of background right now. I don't think it's a major problem even here in Saskatchewan, but it's one that we are seeing rising. So I guess my answer is I hope not very quickly, but I fear that it will. So
Okay.
use
All
it
right.
very sparingly.
Okay, thanks, Sean. When you think about across Canada or even in the West, so Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, are you seeing any regional differences in resistance or in best management for beneficial management practices?
Yeah, for sure. So it kind of depends on the available moisture. Is there any mixed farming operations versus if it's purely grain? If it's purely grain, some of those solutions I have, like marginal land conversion, for example, where we might want to just take that out of production and put a pollinator strip or something or forage there. If there's no forage, not really very useful. Whereas areas where we do have forage and we can introduce those mixed systems, we're seeing a bit more uptake because now there's cows around and things to that nature that we can feed the forage to or the kochia to. So it does depend. And then, for example, in Manitoba, the development of auxinic resistance and kochia was slower to develop versus in Saskatchewan and Alberta, but I've been hearing that the kochia is spreading north there. So that means there's more of it around to develop resistance. So I suspect they'll be catching up.
For everyone out there, what are some of the things that you're seeing as the biggest concerns you're hearing from your growers? Is there anything that you're hearing that you've been asked? And maybe here's now the opportunity to ask Sean or others. We have a wealth of knowledge in this room or this session. So over to you, Jordan. I see a question.
Yeah. So I was just saying, Brad Epp put a question in. Have you ever seen any glyphosate resistance in Canada yet? I've heard rumors that there have been some confirmed in North Dakota.
For glyphosate resistant, we definitely have glyphosate resistant kochia. We've had that now for a while. And then my colleague, Dr. Geddes, confirmed one of the bromes as glyphosate resistant. And then, of course, there's the concerns about water hemp as well, and coming up from the States, as well as in Ontario, Quebec, with different patterns of resistance there.
Sorry, it was glufosinate, not glyphosate.
Glufosinate, lovely. No, no.
Okay.
No. That's an easy answer.
That's an easy answer. Okay, excellent. And glyphosate and glufosinate are spelt very similarly. So if you were reading quickly, I can understand how that got mixed up. Is there any other questions? Like, I just wanted to say, we have retailers in the room. There's a number of people that are here today. Is there one of those 12, or I can't remember the final number of beneficial management practices? What's the key thing retailers should really be like a takeaway from today to work with their growers? Is there one main thing, like if you're going to do one or two things, this is it?
I think it's on the knowledge front. I think it's where we can really make the most ground. Definitely on the scouting side, because that's going to give them better information as well, right? If there's better records about what's worked in the past, it's going to help them. Well, maybe don't use this, use that. And then understanding weed biology. Because it's not just the growers that are coming up with these practices that they're using, right? It's everybody involved. So the more that people understand the pest that they're trying to manage, the better practices that we can build. So I think those are really the two areas that I would promote. And understanding how the weeds are different, right? So an approach that will manage kochia may not manage wild oat. An approach that is going to manage water hemp may not help with the grass. So yeah,
Okay.
I really think those are the big ones.
Oh, okay, good. We have another question about water hemp resistance, and we hear that it is resistant to Roundup in Manitoba. Is that showing up anywhere else in Western Canada? Maybe it's for the whole group, or maybe it's for you, Sean, whichever.
Yeah, so I do have a project on water hemp and Palmer amaranth, trying to keep them out of Saskatchewan and keep Palmer amaranth out of Canada. So I am a little bit familiar. Sorry, what was the question? Oh,
Yeah, have we seen it
is
anywhere
there any more?
else?
Not yet, no. But if you do, please reach out. I'm arranging to get some testing for species identification, so we can help with that. Yeah, but no, it's just been in Manitoba so far. The province through Corey Jacob does a binocular survey for water hemp, kind of in the soybean areas, but we haven't really seen it yet. And hopefully it stays that way, but I don't have a lot of hope in that.
I was at Crop Connect last week and I heard them talking about, water hemp and Palmer amaranth. Can you tell me, as a newbie, are they the same? And you say those two names, they're two different weeds.
Right.
Palmer amaranth and, okay, water hemp.
And water hemp, yeah. So
Okay.
Palmer amaranth is an invasive pigweed that started out around Baja California in the desert there. And then it's spread all through the corn and soy belt, and it's basically their kochia down there. They're really, really bad weed. So it has multiple herbicide resistance to things that we are not dealing with yet. So group 10 resistance, group 3 resistance are the big ones that I'm concerned about. It has multiple stacked resistance. Kansas is a big hotspot in Arkansas, but it's spreading out everywhere. It moves. We are the vectors for them. So moves in the grain, moves on the equipment, moves in the animal systems. Yeah, so that's really bad. Whereas with water hemp, that originally was a bit more northern, and we actually have a native version that they think is less invasive from Canada, and then there's a more invasive version from the States. So they think that it's moving up into Canada, and that's the biotype that's spreading. But so they are different species, but the bad news is they hybridize, and so the acceleration of Palmer amaranth to the north, they think was helped by interbreeding or by hybridizing with water hemp as it moved north. So that's just another thing that I'm watching out for here as well, is that movement. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Are there any questions anyone's in part of this conversation? I can't necessarily see everyone's hands. I think Lisa and Jordan are watching for me, but
There
put
is
up your
another.
hand. Okay.
There is
perfect.
something else in the chat. It says you
Okay.
spoke about feed kochia. What about toxicity and feeding that to the animals?
Yeah, great question. So there is some previous research where they harvested kochia at different staging, from kind of the green Christmas tree looking ones all the way through flowering and kind of the pre-harvest, if you will. So just before it was dried and tumbling, and they found that the better forage value was actually when it was green, and then once it started flowering, not great. The other thing to watch out is nitrate accumulation in the kochia, so which can be toxic to cattle and other animals. So usually it's recommended to be part of a ration. I think some of the growers that I was talking to said about 20%, but please do your research if you're going to incorporate that. But yeah, then the other caveat to feeding kochia is the growers I've talked to had concerns about forming patches in their fields because the cattle, they didn't think were breaking down the kochia. Now, there may be other animal systems where that may be feasible, but for them, they were having observations of now we're starting new patches in the field with the manure. So that's not great either. So if you do harvest it early, it seems to be the best, and then you don't have to worry about the seeds later. So
I was told, or I heard last week, is like if you can't get out there and kill it, you need to go and pick it before it starts developing seeds. Is that something that we're all willing to do? Is go pick these weeds and just to get rid of them? Like, it's a serious concern. We have
yeah.
another comment here about it's hard to believe that Extend is being reviewed, and if there's any comments around that.
Oh, that's the dicamba, right?
Oh, is that okay? Okay, that's one question. But going back to picking weeds, like what are some of the key things we should do? Like, it's critical to stop these weeds before they get to the seed stage and start tumbleweeding.
Yeah, so I'll pick on kochia again since it's the easiest one. Kochia is everybody's problem. So kochia will establish in the cities, in your yard. It will establish on the railways and the oil wells. So that is a weed that everybody can manage, right? So if you see kochia, pick it or mow it down. If it's in your yard, mow it down. The RMs in Saskatchewan, there is a weed act, and kochia is on the weed act, and I have talked to them and have been encouraging to mow because we do see a lot of kochia along the roadways as well. There are options for pre-emerge or post-emerge herbicides there as well. But yeah, kochia is kind of an environmental weed as well as a crop field weed. So that's one where we can really make a lot of ground to kind of stop the weed from moving into the field from those areas.
Okay, I have another question about lamb's quarters. And it's continually harder to control, especially in a year with glufosinate canola. So the glufosinate isn't working very well. Any insight on timing, strategies, etc., to help control lamb's quarters?
It's a good question. That might be one I have to get back to you on.
That's fine. No, that's okay. You don't have
No,
to
that's
answer
fine.
everything. So it's
Stump me on that one. I
anyone
have a
else
couple
out there?
ideas, but yeah.
Anyone else out there have an answer to that one?
I do know this year was really bad for lambs. We were seeing it all over the place too. So it could be just emergence pressures too. If you had a really bad year, then you get 3 really bad years after it. So
So it's almost 1 o'clock. Are there any other questions or ones that I've missed, Lisa or Jordan, in the chat or Q&A?
Nope, I think they were all answered. Yep,
Okay.
I'm not seeing anything right now. Any new ones anyway.
Okay, so these sessions are going to be recorded. They are going to be available for people to watch later on. Your email, Sean, was there if anyone wants to reach out directly. I see Jason sent something here. Jason Weichel, what is your question?
More of a statement. It says AMS and glufosinate helps, I guess, to the question about the lamb's quarters.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jason. But definitely these are recorded. They are available for continuing education points as well. So get in touch with us if you need that. And anything else, Lisa, to wrap up? Next week is going to be on human resources. So taking a little bit of a different focus than on research, but fantastic information shared. Thank you so much, Sean. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, folks.